I grew up in a house that was never truly mine. Sure, it had the same walls, the same roof, the same worn-out carpet that I'd lived on for most of my life, but it never felt like a home. It felt more like a place where everyone just existed around me, doing their own thing, not really noticing me unless it was to ask for help. And I helped, a lot. I always did. It was a small house in the suburbs, nothing special, but it was ours, or at least I thought it was. My dad had been married twice before, and I came into the picture when he was already in his late 30s. I was his first child, and maybe that's why I always felt like I had to work harder to get his attention. But no matter what I did, it always seemed like he was focused on everyone else. My mom died when I was 9. She was everything to me. I'm not sure how my dad coped after losing her, but I remember him slowly becoming less involved in my life, like I was no longer enough to fill the hole she'd left in him. And when he remarried a few years later, things didn't get any better. His second wife, Linda, was fine. She was nice enough, but so wrapped up in her own world that I felt like I barely existed to her. And then there was my stepsister, Katie. Katie was a piece of work. She was 2 years younger than me, but she always acted like she was the center of the universe. At first, I tried to be the big sister, you know? I tried to teach her things, be supportive, but that didn't last long. She was spoiled, entitled, and always got her way. If she wanted something, she whined until she got it. If I wanted something, I had to beg for it, prove I deserved it, or even worse, wait until my dad came around to agreeing with me. Dad always said he didn't want to pick favorites, but I could see it. He bent over backward to accommodate Katie's every whim, even when I was left holding the bag. College was a big deal to me, especially because I was the first in our family to even think about going. I had been saving up every cent I could for years. I babysat, worked part-time jobs, did everything I could to make sure I would be able to afford school. It wasn't easy, but I kept my eyes on the prize. I dreamed of leaving this house, of building my own life where I could breathe freely without feeling invisible. But then Katie decided she wanted to start her own fashion boutique. I remember the day Dad told me about it. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't quite place. I was folding laundry, minding my own business, when he finally looked up at me like he'd just had a moment of realization. "Katie's going to open her own store," he said casually, like it was no big deal. "She's been talking about it for a while now. I'm thinking of helping her out with some money. She needs it more than you do right now." My stomach dropped. I couldn't even process what I was hearing at first. I stood there, clutching a pair of jeans in my hands, not sure if I should speak or just walk out of the room. "Your what?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Her boutique, honey. It's a big investment, but I think it's what she needs to get started. You know how she's been struggling. Besides, you've got scholarships and I've got your college funds. You'll still be fine." I thought I was going to choke on the air in that room. Her boutique? The one I had overheard her talk about for months? And it had been nothing but failure after failure in her business plan? She was still a freshman in college, a girl who had no concept of real-world work. She didn't even know how to manage money. And my dad, my own dad, was going to take the money he promised to me and pour it into that disaster? I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to say. Every ounce of my effort, all those hours I'd put into earning that money, seemed to be worth nothing now. What did it even matter? I wasn't the one who mattered to him. I wasn't the one who deserved his attention or support. "You'll still get your chance, I promise," he continued, like he was reassuring me about something that was somehow meant to make everything okay. "It's just that Katie really needs this right now. Katie needs it more than you." Those words echoed in my head. I couldn't even look at him. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He was already so wrapped up in the idea of helping her, like she was some fragile thing that needed saving. I wasn't fragile, I was strong, and I had been building my future, quietly, on my own. But now I was being told that everything I'd done wasn't enough, everything I'd earned, a joke. I walked out of the kitchen without saying another word, but inside, my world was crumbling. The future I'd worked for felt out of reach, and all the promises made to me about my future, my success, my independence were worthless. The betrayal stung, and this time it was too much to ignore. I don't remember the exact moment everything inside me shifted. It wasn't like a sudden lightning strike, but more like the slow, gnawing feeling of something eating away at the core of everything I thought was real. It was a combination of betrayal, anger, and disappointment. The day Dad told me he'd used my college savings to bail out Katie's boutique felt like the beginning of the end. But it wasn't until a week later, when I walked into the kitchen to find him sitting at the table, that I realized just how far he'd gone. "Hey, kiddo," Dad said, his voice oddly cheerful as I entered. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through messages. His glasses were perched on his nose, the way he always wore them when he was pretending to focus. I could tell he hadn't even noticed me walk in. I froze in the doorway. I was so angry, so tired of pretending that everything was fine. But I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to acknowledge me first. He didn't. It was like he expected me to just let everything slide. "Dad," I finally said, my voice unsteady, "we need to talk." He looked up from his phone, his expression casual. It almost made me sick to look at him. He looked so comfortable, like everything was just normal, like he hadn't completely shattered any trust I had left in him. "About what?" he asked, a little too innocently, as if he didn't already know. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands shook, and my heart pounded, but I wasn't going to break down now. This was too important. "About the money, the college fund." My words came out sharp and cold. I was doing my best to hold back tears, but the hurt was spilling over. "The money you took, my money." He looked at me blankly, like he hadn't processed what I was saying. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone still annoyingly calm. "Don't play dumb with me, Dad," I snapped. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You took the money from my college savings, the money I've been working my ass off to save, that you promised me, and you gave it to Katie, to her damn failing boutique." He sighed and set his phone down, rubbing his temple. "I'm not going to argue with you about this again. It's already done. Katie needed it. She's struggling, and you're fine. You've got scholarships and other options. You don't need that money as much as she does." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't need it?" I couldn't believe he actually said that. "I've worked my whole life for that. It's not about whether I need it more than her. You promised me that money was for college, for my future." He leaned back in his chair and gave me that look, the one he always gave me when he thought he was right and I was just being emotional. "Listen, I get it. I understand you're upset, but I did this because I believe in helping family. Katie's future is at risk, and I couldn't just sit by and let her fail. She needs me, just like you needed me when you were growing up." My mouth went dry. The hypocrisy, the selfishness. He was trying to make it sound like he was doing something noble, like he was saving her. But the reality was clear. He was choosing her over me, over my hard work and my dreams. My entire life had been about proving myself, working hard, and following the rules. And now, it seemed like none of that mattered. What mattered was who could get the most attention, who could whine the loudest. And Katie, of course, was his golden child, the one who could do no wrong. "No," I said firmly, the anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't do this because you believe in family. You did this because you've always thought she was more important. You've always chosen her over me. You're the one who taught me to sacrifice for others, but now you're telling me I'm supposed to just let you take what's mine and give it to her. And then, what, expect me to smile and say thank you?" He stood up, the chair scraping across the floor with a sharp noise. "Don't talk to me like that. I'm your father. You should be more understanding of the choices I've had to make." "Understand?" I laughed bitterly. "You expect me to understand that you stole from my future to bail out your little princess? No, I don't understand, and I'm not going to pretend like I do." I felt my whole body shake with the force of my words. It was like something inside me had snapped. For so long, I'd been the good daughter, the one who always did what she was told, the one who kept quiet when things weren't fair. But this was the last straw. I wasn't going to keep being the dutiful daughter if it meant watching my dad rip apart everything I cared about. "So what now?" Dad asked, his voice strained. "You're just going to cut me off? Turn your back on your family like this?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not cutting you off, Dad. You already did that to me. I'm just not going to keep paying for your mistakes. I'm done with this." I turned and walked out of the room, not looking back. As I headed upstairs to my room, I could hear him shouting behind me, his voice rising in anger, but I didn't care anymore. I'd made my decision. If he didn't value me, then I sure as hell wasn't going to keep sacrificing for him. I wasn't going to cover his debts anymore. I wasn't going to pay his mortgage. I was done. I was going to take control of my life no matter what. And I was moving out. It's funny how, when you make a decision that feels like it should be empowering, it's often the hardest thing you'll ever do. Walking away from my dad felt like stepping off a cliff, but I had no choice anymore. I couldn't stay in that house, under that roof, and pretend like everything was fine. So I found a place of my own, a tiny one-bedroom apartment, not far from where I grew up. The rent wasn't cheap, and the walls were thin, but it was mine. It was mine in a way that I hadn't felt about anything in years. The first few days after I moved out were a mix of relief and dread. It was liberating, yes, but also incredibly lonely. I'd spent my whole life in that house with my dad and Katie, dealing with the simmering resentment that had been growing for years. And now I was here alone. I could breathe, but I wasn't sure if I liked the taste of freedom just yet. I didn't hear from Dad for a couple of days. I figured he was probably trying to let things cool off. I wasn't surprised. He had always been the type to avoid confrontation when things got real. But as the silence stretched on, I found myself second-guessing everything. Was I being too harsh? Was I wrong for standing up for myself? But then, just as I was starting to doubt my decision, the calls started coming. "Why are you doing this?" Dad's voice echoed through my phone, and I couldn't help but feel a little cold at the familiar tone. "You're just throwing away everything we've worked for. For what? To go live in some dump?" I stood in the middle of my small apartment, phone pressed to my ear, fighting back the urge to hang up. "It's not about the apartment, Dad. It's about respect. You stole from me. You took my future and handed it to Katie like it was no big deal." "That's not what happened." His voice was a little louder now, defensive, but still trying to sound like the reasonable one. "I'm doing what any father would do. I'm helping my daughter." "You're helping her ruin her future, not save it," I shot back. "And what about me, huh? What about everything I've worked for? I'm the one who saved that money. I'm the one who didn't get everything handed to me like Katie." "You don't understand," his voice cracked, a rare moment of emotion slipping through his usual bravado. "She's my daughter, too. I can't let her fail. You don't need the money. You've got all these scholarships. And look, I've always done what I thought was best for the family." "You've always done what was best for you," I muttered. The words were out before I could stop them. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "You think I'm some kind of monster? I've worked my ass off to make sure both of you have everything you need." "I didn't need you to take my future away to help her," I snapped. The words hit me like a punch, but they felt good coming out. "You've always chosen Katie. You've always chosen her over me. So stop pretending this is some big sacrifice. You're just looking for an excuse to play the hero while throwing me under the bus." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear him seething. Finally he spoke, quieter this time. "You're being selfish." I shook my head, pacing around my tiny living room. "Selfish? No. I'm finally standing up for myself. I've been playing this game your way for too long, and I'm done." The call ended with him hanging up. I stood there, phone in hand, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding, but I felt a small sense of victory. I wasn't letting him manipulate me anymore. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the look on my dad's face when he realized I wasn't going to back down. He couldn't understand why I was so upset. He couldn't understand why I didn't just go along with it like I always had. But I wasn't that person anymore. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Katie. "Dad says you're being a jerk. You need to stop acting like you're the only one who matters." I rolled my eyes as I read it, but something inside me snapped. She had the nerve to come at me like this? She didn't care about me. She didn't care about anyone but herself. She was the one who had everything handed to her. Why was she suddenly playing the victim? I didn't even bother responding, but I wasn't ready for what happened next. The doorbell rang around noon, and when I opened it, I was greeted by the sight of my dad, standing there with a grim expression on his face. "What are you doing here?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. The sight of him, standing there like he had every right to be in my space, made my blood boil. "I came to talk," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Talk?" I repeated, incredulity rising in my voice. "What's there to talk about, Dad? I made my decision." His jaw tightened, and I could see the frustration on his face. "I'm trying to save face here. Katie's devastated. She thinks you've abandoned the family. You're ruining everything." "Ruining what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You're the one who ruined everything by taking my future away. Don't sit here and tell me about family when all you've ever done is prioritize her over me. I'm done pretending everything is okay." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my fingers twitching with the urge to do something, anything, besides just stand there and listen to him talk. He had the audacity to act like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "Don't you dare!" he hissed, stepping forward. "You don't get to just walk away from your family. You're not a little girl anymore. You can't keep pulling these stunts and expect there to be no consequences." "You're right," I said, stepping back, holding my ground. "I'm not a little girl, and I'm not going to be your doormat anymore." He glared at me, and for a moment we just stood there, the tension between us thick enough to cut. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter but still full of that anger I couldn't stand. "Fine, but when this all falls apart, don't come crawling back to me." "Don't worry," I replied, my voice steady and firm. "I won't." I closed the door before he could say another word. And just like that, it was over. Or at least I thought it was. But Katie wasn't done with me yet. It's strange how a single moment can change everything. How everything you've been holding in, all the hurt, all the rage, can suddenly burst to the surface as if it's been waiting for the right trigger. For me, that moment came 2 weeks after I'd moved out. I was sitting on the couch in my apartment, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I got the call. It was from my dad. At first, I almost didn't pick up. I'd had enough of his manipulations, enough of his attempts to guilt-trip me into coming back to the family fold. But something in me urged me to answer. Maybe it was a sense of finality that needed to happen. Maybe I needed him to know that I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. "Dad," I answered, my voice neutral but firm. "I need to talk to you," he said immediately, his tone unusually tight. "It's important." I could hear the urgency in his voice, but I wasn't sure if it was genuine or if he was just trying to manipulate me again. Still, I agreed. "Okay, talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him weighing his words before he spoke again, as if he was trying to find the right angle. "Katie, she's in trouble. The boutique, it's a mess. The money I gave her, it didn't help. The place is losing more customers every day, and she can't pay the rent anymore. She's asking for more." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to remain calm. Of course this was happening. I knew it would. I'd tried to warn him. I had begged him to see sense, but instead, he'd chosen Katie. He'd chosen to throw my future away, to gamble with something he didn't even care about. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice betraying none of the bitterness I felt bubbling up. "But I'm not going to help her. I'm not going to fix her mistakes. I told you this would happen." He didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, like he was trying to keep his temper in check. "You don't get it," he said finally, his voice rising. "She needs me. She's my daughter. You're so busy with your own life that you don't even care about your family anymore. You're selfish." My fists clenched at my sides. Selfish? I wasn't the one who had stolen from my future to help someone who hadn't even earned it. "Dad, I'm not selfish. I'm finally doing what's right for me, what's right for my future. You're the one who's been selfish, ignoring me for years and only focusing on Katie. You can't keep using me like this." "Don't you dare lecture me!" His voice was shaking now, and I could tell he was at the end of his patience. "I'm your father, and I've been there for you through everything. All I ever did was try to help you. I gave you everything." "Everything?" I repeated bitterly. "Everything? You gave me a life where I had to fight for every scrap of attention, for every ounce of validation. You gave me nothing when it mattered most, and now you want me to save your other daughter when she fails?" There was another long pause, and I knew he was trying to process my words, trying to find a way to manipulate the situation in his favor again. But this time, I wasn't backing down. I was done with his games. "I'm not asking you to save her," he said, his tone softer now, more pleading. "I'm asking you to be a part of this family again. We need you, honey. I need you. Don't you want to help your family?" It was the same old guilt trip, the same thing he'd always pulled, but it didn't have the same effect anymore. I wasn't buying it, not this time. "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to help. Not this time. Not when you've made it clear that I don't matter to you. You've shown me where I stand in your life, and I won't let you drag me back into this mess." "You're making a huge mistake," he warned, but his voice cracked with desperation. "You'll regret this." "I won't regret anything," I said, my voice hard, my words like steel. "And if you really want to help Katie, then let her learn. Let her face the consequences of her actions, because that's how people grow. Not by getting everything handed to them, not by using others as stepping stones." There was another silence, but this time, I didn't care. My heart was racing, my mind clear. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to be his backup plan anymore, his second choice, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. I heard a muffled voice in the background, Katie's, I realized. She must have been there with him, feeding him all her complaints and guilt. "Tell her to come back! She has to come back! It's her fault we're in this situation." Her voice echoed through the phone, shrill and desperate. I couldn't take it anymore. It was the final straw. She had the audacity to blame me for everything, after she was the one who had manipulated him into giving her my money? I wasn't about to let her do this to me again. "Tell Katie to stop calling me," I said, my voice sharp. "I've had enough of both of you." And with that, I hung up. I stood there for a moment, the phone in my hand, the weight of what had just happened settling over me like a heavy fog. I felt exhausted, but I also felt something else, something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. I was done with the manipulations, done with the guilt, done with the lies. But that wasn't the end. The doorbell rang about an hour later. I had just finished throwing some leftover takeout in the trash when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a delivery, but the sound was persistent. It was sharp, demanding. I opened the door, expecting to see a package or maybe a neighbor. But standing there, looking like a thunderstorm ready to crack open, was my dad. "Dad?" I said, trying to keep the shock out of my voice. "Don't you dare walk away from me again," he snarled, stepping forward. He was furious, beyond anything I had seen before. His face was red, his hands clenched at his sides, and then, from behind him, I saw Katie, standing there with that look of righteous indignation, like she was entitled to everything I had. I knew what was coming, but I was done running. "Get out of my way," I said calmly, my voice cold as steel. "I'm not doing this anymore." "Enough with your attitude," Dad barked. "You've ruined everything. We're family. Do you hear me? You owe us." I stepped forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I owe you nothing." And then I slammed the door in their faces. I knew right then that I had finally done it. I had broken free. The silence in my apartment was deafening after I slammed the door. I stood there for a long moment, leaning against it, just trying to catch my breath. It felt like everything I'd been holding inside for years had just poured out in one final, brutal release. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd just cut off. I knew what it meant. This was the point of no return. But even as the adrenaline started to fade, something unexpected happened. I felt free. For the first time in so long, I felt like I could breathe without someone else's expectations suffocating me. It was terrifying, but it was also the most liberating feeling I'd ever known. I had done it. I had finally stood up for myself, and the world hadn't come crashing down around me. I didn't feel guilty, and I didn't feel sorry. I had tried to be the good daughter, the responsible one. I had done everything they asked, but somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't the one they cared about. I was just a convenience, a tool to make their lives easier, a backup plan for when things went wrong. But now I was done. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing my future just because they were too caught up in their own messes. I wasn't going to keep letting them walk all over me. The next few weeks weren't easy. I expected my dad to keep calling, to try to get me back, to throw more guilt at me, but oddly enough, he didn't. He kept his distance, and for the first time, I realized that it wasn't because he was respecting my decision. It was because he didn't know how to deal with me standing up for myself. Katie, on the other hand, didn't let go so easily. She bombarded me with texts full of angry accusations and manipulative pleas. But I ignored them all. She would send me long messages about how I was the one who had ruined the family, how I was the one who had abandoned them. I didn't even bother responding. I didn't owe her anything, not anymore. There was a small part of me that still wondered if I was being too harsh. I mean, Katie was my stepsister, and part of me wanted to help her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about helping her anymore. It was about me. It was about me finally living my life on my terms. By the time a month had passed, I'd settled into a routine. Work was busier than ever, but I was finally able to focus on my career, something I'd neglected for years while trying to please my family. I'd also started taking classes at a local community college, using the money I had left to start working toward my dream of getting a degree. It wasn't easy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I was determined to make it work. One evening, I was sitting at my small kitchen table, looking over my notes when I got a call from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. Part of me thought it might be my dad, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. I'd been waiting for him to come around, but I wasn't sure I could handle hearing him beg for forgiveness. I picked up the phone, my throat tight. "Hello?" I answered. "Hi, is this your name?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, calm, and polite. "Yes, this is she," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's calling?" "My name is Jessica. I'm the leasing agent for the building your father has been renting from for the past few years." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What's this about?" "Well, there's no easy way to put this, but your father has missed several payments. He's behind on his mortgage, and we've tried to reach him multiple times. We need to know if you're willing to take over the lease. Otherwise, we may have to start eviction proceedings." The weight of the words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt a surge of anger at the thought of him using me all this time, and now he was in financial trouble again, but this time I wasn't the one he could rely on. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cold. "I can't help him. He made his choices." I hung up before she could say anything more. As I sat there staring at the phone in my hand, I realized just how much had changed. A year ago, I would have been the one rushing in to pay his debts, to fix everything for him. I would have felt obligated to save him from the consequences of his own actions. But not anymore. I wasn't going to be his safety net anymore. I wasn't going to keep carrying him when he wouldn't carry me. A few days later, I ran into my dad at a coffee shop. I had been waiting in line when I turned around and almost collided with him. For a moment, we both froze. His face was drawn, older than I remembered, and he didn't look like the man I had once respected. He looked defeated. "Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Hi," he said softly, looking down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. I stared at him for a moment, feeling that familiar pull of guilt, but then I remembered how he had treated me, how he had always chosen Katie over me, and the weight of my decision felt lighter than ever. "You look good," he said, his voice a little too quiet. "I've been meaning to call you about everything." I shook my head, crossing my arms. "You don't need to. I've made my decision, Dad." He nodded, like he already knew what I was going to say. "I know. I thought maybe I could make things right." "You can't," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "You made your choices, and so did I." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. For the first time in a long time, there was a moment of silence between us, a moment where I felt no obligation, no guilt, just peace. "You're right," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "I messed up." I nodded, the closure I needed finally falling into place. "You did, but I'm done trying to fix you. I'm fixing me now." I walked away, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. I didn't need his approval anymore. I didn't need anyone's approval. I had found my strength, my voice, and the freedom to live my life on my own terms, and I wasn't about to lose it for anyone.